When I was first asked to come here, they asked me to talk about market research. And I certainly understand what market research is. It's pretty commonly used and even used to describe my professional career. I wouldn't actually use that term, but I understand why it's used. Market research comes from the business world and is all about persuasion, how to do a better job of marketing products and services. And this is as we might expect, given that we live in a market economy, and this sort of activity is prevalent. But it is a fairly narrow definition of research, focusing on, in a sense, selling goods and services. And as everyone here can appreciate, that's not the only activity that matters. And I'm sure most of you in the room who are involved in activities that are non-commercial can appreciate that. A broader way to think about survey research is as a means to better understand the social realities, to answer important questions that we or organizations might have, a kind of knowledge that we may not possess through other sources. And this knowledge may be better understanding the world of your donors, your clients, your stakeholders, your volunteers, or the general public. And as I'm sure you can appreciate, if you haven't already found in your own experience, capturing this kind of knowledge can be a little bit slippery because it's a bit more subjective and hard to document than other kinds of knowledge that we may have. But in addition to this sort of practical application of research, survey research can also serve a broader purpose. And this is to help foster introspection and empathy in the increasingly diverse world that we live in, as a way to understand what it's like to be somebody else, somebody from a different religion, or somebody with a different skin color, or what it means to be a man or a woman in this society. This type of application of survey research is the kind of focus that the Environics Institute, where I work, tends to focus on. When we think about surveys, most of the oxygen seems to be taken up by the marketing narrative, or of course political polling, which is simply another application of marketing if you think about it. But it's important to understand the antecedents of social and survey research, which comes from a very different paradigm than what we're used to thinking about. The problem with political polls is that they're rarely very helpful in helping you to understand what really matters to people, what their issues and priorities are. You don't tend to see this in political polls. And if you think about it in terms of political polls, they may be really interesting and possibly important at a particular moment in time. That moment passes until you see the next poll, or until you see the actual election. Once the election's happened, all that information is pretty useless. It no longer has any value. The problem is, because our political and media polls are so ubiquitous, they tend to shape our perceptions and understanding of what survey research is all about. And they make a poor model on which to base our thinking about how this research might be valuable for our organizations. So, consider political polls for their entertainment value, and by all means pay attention if they help you decide who you might want to vote for. And indeed, in the most recent mayoral election here in Toronto, in fact, a lot of voters probably relied on the polls to make decisions about who they might support. But do your best not to let these polls shape your understanding and your view about what surveys can do beyond this particular purpose. This takes us to idea number 2. Idea number 2. The unique contribution of surveys comes from their power to combine many individual stories that together tell an important collective story. So I'm going to repeat that because it's a bit of a mouthful. The unique contribution of surveys comes from their power to combine many individual stories together that tell an important collective story. There are many sources of knowledge that we all gain about our social realities from our direct experience, through friends and informal networks, through media, through literature, art, and music. Survey research is certainly no more important than any of these, but it does offer something unique. It offers the power of collecting individual stories that, when combined, equal more than the sum of the parts. The power of this technology, and I do think technology is an appropriate term to use here, is threefold. First, it provides a voice for individuals to express themselves privately without the direct influence of group or normative pressures, such as you might see in town hall meetings or even focus groups. Second, It harnesses the power of statistics and the scientific method to combine those individual voices into a collective voice that is credible and widely accepted as representative of the group or population being covered. And third, it makes it possible to examine and understand how individuals within the collective may be similar or different based on who they are, their lived experience, where they live, their social values. This last point is particularly important because one of the most problematic aspects of public opinion polls and how they're reported is this notion of the unified public opinion, that everyone in Canada or everyone in Toronto has one particular view about whatever the topic is. Take, for example, a recent headline, quote, "Canadians express little desire to reopen abortion laws in their country," unquote. Now, does this headline accurately represent or capture the opinions of all Canadians or simply the view of some particular majority of them? Such headlines are really just that. But the problem is headlines tend to readily get accepted as sort of the answer to the question and loses sight of what the broad diversity of opinion might be. It may be important to know what the majority are thinking, but it's also important to understand what the other groups are thinking as well to really get the whole picture and not just suddenly think that whatever the plurality or majority think is the view that everyone has. Social media does provide some opportunity for a broad range of views to be expressed. The problem is it's really hard to know how representative a social media collective is on any particular topic. Idea number 3. The primary task of survey design and analysis is one of translation, transforming your organization's questions into a language that is meaningful to those you want to hear from, and then reinterpreting what they tell you back to answer those questions. I think this is a useful way to think about the process of designing, implementing, and interpreting surveys because it reminds us there's a really important distinction between what you want to learn, which is your organization's questions, and how you speak to the audience you're going to survey. And those are the survey questions themselves. These can, in effect, be very distinct languages, except in those rare situations where you may be surveying experts in your field, in which case they may be fairly similar. The initial process of survey design, the initial translation process is that of survey design, and that is more of a how-to of how you design survey questions and know what the language and framing is. Don't have time to talk about that today. That how-to part is something that I sometimes offer to organizations when I put on my consulting hat. What I think is important to emphasize is that this process of developing survey questions and questionnaires is really a mixture of science and art, and it really is harder than it looks. When training young researchers in this field, it's typically the survey design and question development part that's the last thing that we teach them because it requires the greatest amount of experience and nuance. And of course, once the data's been collected, the translation process runs back in reverse, and you want to reinterpret what respondents tell you back into a language that really answers your organization's questions. And this language is not primarily about numbers, which takes us to idea number 4. Idea number 4. Numbers are an important component of survey research, but survey research in the end is not about the numbers. It's about the story behind them. That probably applies to many other pursuits in life too. We need the numbers to locate and capture the right sample and to measure and to design questions and measure the responses. But the true value is a narrative that comes out of those numbers that describe the social reality of what we're really trying to learn about. What is it like to be someone else? What are the needs or priorities of our stakeholders or clients or volunteers or whoever we want to learn from? The numbers are just the numbers. The meaning has to be pulled out of them. Now, perhaps this is obvious. I don't know. It may be to many people, and perhaps it's a truism, but most of the survey reports that I see, and I expect you see, is probably pretty heavy on the numbers and pretty light on a narrative or a story that comes out of them. And this is in part because the numbers do have power, and they do answer at least some of the questions that we may have. And so it's easy to conclude that once we have the numbers, we've really got what we need to know. And if there's a limited time or limited budget, we may not go any further. It is more challenging to find the story in the numbers, and typically it won't happen unless the sponsor or the client or whoever's driving the project doesn't expect it or require it. In my own career, I learned this lesson about 2 decades ago from somebody that I worked with, the head of a research company. He required everybody in his company to write executive summaries of their survey reports that had 2 qualities. 1, it had to fit on a single page. And 2, it couldn't not contain a single number. So that was the requirement. He did not let a report go out the door unless it fit those requirements. As you can imagine, this was a very difficult task and an unusual style, and it took quite a while to figure out how to do this properly. And even today, in any project that I may be involved in, it's putting that final conclusion section together that's the most difficult part of the process, because it takes a certain amount of hard thought, and there's no statistical solution or shortcuts in order of doing that. Today, I believe most survey reports are in a PowerPoint format. You don't see written reports that much anymore. And PowerPoint certainly makes for a somewhat more concise type of report, fewer words, maybe fewer numbers, maybe easier to read. But that doesn't guarantee that the report is going to be as insightful or really answer your questions and tell you the story. Bullet points can work very effectively in supporting a presentation such as this one, but not so well when you have only the report. And it's just you and the report, and you're there all by yourself, and you're facing those bullets. Doesn't always make sense. And finally, to idea number 5. Idea number 5. Survey research is all about give and take. It should be as valuable to the participants as it is to the researcher and the sponsor. All of us, our organizations, are concerned with our own missions, our own purpose, the things we have to get done. And when we decide to conduct a survey, we're looking specifically to address our particular needs. And perhaps that's as it should be. But conducting a survey is unlike other forms of knowledge acquisition, like purchasing secondary data or intellectual property or buying media monitoring. Because it involves contacting and engaging individuals for whom you're asking to volunteer their time to divulge something about themselves to you for free. And even when you offer a modest incentive, as is often done with certain surveys, focus groups, for instance, and other surveys, you're not really paying people the value of their time. It's not a matter of economic exchange where you're paying them their hourly rate or whatever they're worth. It's really a form of what we call social exchange. It's really a different process. The only survey respondents that get paid for their time are physicians. And that's because the pharmaceutical industry is profitable enough to pay physicians what it takes. And so now there are normative expectations, and you cannot get a doctor to do a survey unless you're willing to pay $200 or $300 or more if they're a specialist. The point here is that you cannot buy survey participants. And this means you need to accept and work with the voluntary nature of the process that you're going through. There are various methodologies, techniques, and ways of doing that, and I don't have time to cover that here. But it's the main point is to appreciate that it is a matter of social reciprocity between what you want from them and you're not paying them, and so what are they prepared to do for you? And to look to see to make this experience as meaningful for them as you possibly can. Now, how would you do this? Well, consider how your survey may be relevant to the individuals that you are surveying. Try and make the process as respectful and as engaging as you possibly can. And finally, see about how you could perhaps share the results of your survey with those participants so they can learn some of the same things that you're learning yourself. In short, it's important to remember that survey research is a social act, not a scientific experiment. So that makes 5 ideas. I think I've covered the map. I hope you find them worthwhile and that they elevate your understanding and appreciation of survey research and what it can do for you in your work and your organization, and that you, like me, will be inspired by those 18th century pioneers who who got the ball rolling. So thank you very much.